Hello guys! Welcome to another episode of Spooky Bedtime Stories. The first story is a spooky ghost story about a man who gets caught in a storm and takes refuge in an abandoned house. I went out for a cycle, one gray Sunday afternoon, on a lonely country road. I was miles from anywhere and got caught in a storm. The rain was pelting down and there was no place to take shelter. Up ahead, not far from the road, I saw a large house that seemed to be deserted. It was an old chateau and the walls were covered in poison ivy. Most of the windows had been boarded up, and it was obvious that it had been empty for a number of years. I decided to take shelter inside, and when I tried the front door, I was surprised to find it was unlocked. Indoors, there was a stale odor of damp and rotting wood. The house had an eerie feeling that made me a little uneasy. For some reason, the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. Looking down, I happened to notice an odd trail in the dust that looked quite recent. It was as if something or someone had been dragged down the hallway. The strangest thing was that there were no footprints in the dust, just drag marks. There was an old coat hanging on the end of the staircase. Picking it up, I took a look at the worn and moth-eaten garment. In the back of the coat, there was a small hole, and the area around it was scorched and stained. It looked something like a bullet hole. It gave me the creeps. Did this mean that, at one time, the coat had been worn by a dead man? There was a stale odor of dampness and mold coming from the old coat. I got the feeling that it might be more than mold. There was a putrid smell of rot and decay. If I didn't know better, I would have said it was the stench of decomposing flesh. Standing there in the hallway, a sudden feeling of danger came over me, but with a slight shudder, I brushed it off. The whole atmosphere of the place seemed to be charged with evil. I went into the living room and tried to start a fire. While I was piling some damp wood into the fireplace, I tried to pull myself together and told myself that there was nothing to be frightened of. Even though the chateau was creepy and I wouldn't want to spend the night there, it was better than getting drenched in the driving rain. Just then, I was startled by the sound of movement coming from the hallway. There was a single soft flop, as if something had dropped to the ground. I froze and strained my ears to listen, but there was no further sound. Creeping quietly over to the door, I looked out. There was nothing in the hallway. All I could hear was the sound of the heavy rain outside. Then, I noticed something strange. The old coat that had been hanging at the end of the stairs was gone. A chill crept down my spine, and I had the strangest feeling that I was no longer alone. Just then, I heard a low evil chuckle, echoing down the hallway, followed by the sound of stealthy movement. I turned just in time to see a shapeless, black mass rise up behind me. It was the coat. The empty sleeves jerked grotesquely at its sides as it slowly moved towards me. I couldn't take my eyes off it. As the thing advanced, I took a step backwards until I bumped against the fireplace. The empty sleeves reached out for my throat. I grabbed a poker from the fireplace and swung it with all my might, lashing out at the thing in front of me. As soon as I struck it, the coat collapsed to the ground in a heap. I fled from the room and ran out the front door as fast as I could. Looking back over my shoulder, I saw a black shape on the doorstep. I could have sworn it was the coat, lying there, watching me escape. I didn't stop running until I came to a small country pub by the side of the road. I ordered a drink to steady my nerves and cautiously asked the landlord if he knew anything about the deserted house. After a while, he told me that it had once been occupied by a man who was a staff sergeant in the army. Those who knew him said he was the meanest man ever to walk the earth. They say he murdered his wife and tortured every living thing he could lay his hands on, including his own daughters. In the end, said the landlord, One of the daughters couldn't take the abuse any longer and wound up shooting him in the back with his own gun. The next story is a scary story about three girls who encounter a ghost and that anyone who sees her is doomed to die. There were three girls named Erica, Christy and Jenna. One cold evening, they were walking home from school together when they decided to take a shortcut through the woods. It was raining and the girls huddled together under an umbrella. The path they took followed a crooked stream that ran through the woods. The light was quickly fading, and a fine mist settled over everything. The woods were eerily silent, and, in the gloom, the branches of the trees looked like gnarled claws reaching out to grab them. All of a sudden, the girls spotted something that made them stop in their tracks. Up ahead, they saw a figure crouched at the edge of the stream. When they went closer, they realized it was a woman. She was bending over and washing her clothes in the water. The woman was creepy looking. She wore a ragged gray shawl, and her long black hair hung down over her face. The clothes she was washing were stained with blood, and the water in the stream was running red. The girls gasped in horror at the shocking sight, and they ran off, stumbling over roots and branches and tree stumps, until they finally reached Jenna's house. The terrified girls told Jenna's mother what they had seen. "That sounds like the laundry woman," Jenna's mother said. "My grandparents told me about her when I was just a child. They say she washes the funeral shrouds of those who are about to die. It's an omen of death." "What?" cried Jenna. "If you see her, does it mean you're going to die?" "I don't know," her mother replied. "All I know is that it's bad luck to set eyes on her." The three girls flew into a panic, and Jenna's mother tried to calm them down. "The laundry woman is just an old ghost story," she said. "She's not real. It's nothing but an old superstition. Years ago, people used to believe in it, but not nowadays. I'm sure what you saw was just some poor old woman who can't afford a washing machine." Despite what Jenna's mother said, the girls were still nervous. Erica decided to go home and Christy decided to spend the night at Jenna's house to keep her company. That night, the wind rose up and a heavy rain began to fall. All night long, the house was rocked by the breeze and Christy and Jenna barely got a wink of sleep. When they woke up the next morning and looked out the window, everything was covered in a blanket of fog. School was cancelled, but Jenna's parents still had to go to work. The two girls were left at home on their own. Shortly after breakfast, they tried to give Erica a call and invite her over, but when they called her phone, there was no answer. Christy and Jenna were worried, so they went over to Erica's house and knocked on the door. Erica's mother answered the door. Her eyes were red and her face was streaked with tears. "Erica didn't come home last night," she sobbed. "The police searched the woods this morning and they found her, or what was left of her. She had been chopped up into pieces, and her body parts were floating in the stream." Erica's mother was too upset to say anything more and she slammed the door. Christy and Jenna were scared out of their wits. It seemed as if the legends about the laundry woman was coming true. They raced back to Jenna's house and they were afraid to go outside for the rest of the day. They sat together in Jenna's bedroom, talking about Erica and trying to convince themselves it was just a coincidence. All of a sudden, the power went out and the girls were plunged into darkness. Christy and Jenna clung to each other, shaking with fear. They waited and waited, but nothing happened. Eventually, they both let out a sigh of relief. "I was sure that was the laundry woman coming to kill us." Jenna laughed. "Me too." Christy chuckled. The girls were hungry, so they decided to go downstairs to the kitchen and fix themselves a snack. Jenna lit some candles and placed them on the table to give them some light. It was pitch black outside and her parents wouldn't be home for hours. The girls raided the cupboards and made themselves some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. As they were eating, Christy suddenly began to make a gagging sound. Her eyes grew wide and her hands clawed at her throat. She was choking. Jenna flew into a panic as she tried to help her friend. Christy was coughing and spluttering, and her face was turning bright red. She fell to the ground and stopped breathing. Jenna didn't know what to do. She screamed and pounded on Christy's chest, but it was no good. The girl was dead. Jenna just sat there on the floor, covering her face with her hands and crying uncontrollably. She looked down at her friend. Christy's face was purple and twisted in a grotesque grimace. Her lips were blue and her tongue was thrust out. It was a disgusting sight. Jenna couldn't bear to look at her any longer, so she got a blanket and draped it over her friend's corpse. She ran to the phone and tried to call her parents, but there was no dial tone. The lines must be down, she thought. She took out her phone, but there was no reception. In desperation, Jenna ran out of the house and went to try and get help. It was freezing cold outside, and the night was as black as pitch. She trudged through the snow, shivering and shaking, but she got disoriented and didn't know where she was going. Her teeth were chattering and she felt like she was going to freeze to death. Eventually, she was forced to turn back. She managed to make it back to her house, and when she got back inside safe and sound, she breathed a sigh of relief. She set about warming herself up, rubbing her arms and legs to get the circulation going again. Jenna was afraid she would get sick, so she went searching for some medicine. She stumbled down the darkened hallway and made her way to the bathroom. Rummaging through the shelves in the dim light, she found a bottle, opened it and gulped down the contents. All of a sudden, she began coughing and splattering. A horrible pain shot through her whole body. She felt like her throat was burning. Her stomach felt like it was being torn apart from the inside. The room began to spin and she fell to the ground, writhing around in excruciating pain. Just then, the lights came back on. Jenna looked down at the bottle she was holding in her hand. Through her blurred vision, she could just about make out the label. To her horror, she realized that what she drank wasn't cough syrup at all. It was bleach. Next story is a creepy bedtime story about a young boy who is afraid to go to bed because he fears there is something evil lurking in his bedroom. For a tired child, bedtime is always a happy and relaxing event when they relax and drift off into a restful slumber. Some children complain when their parents force them to go to sleep before their bedtime. For me, bedtime was always a fearful and terrifying event that I dreaded every night. My fear of sleeping began when I was 8 years old. My parents moved me into my own bedroom, a small and narrow room at the back of the house, just large enough for a bunk bed and a chest of drawers. It had only one window which looked out onto the back garden and didn't let in much light. It was the first time I had ever slept on my own, and from the very first night, I remember experiencing a strange feeling of unease. As I lay on the top bunk, trying to fall asleep, I thought I heard a noise. I couldn't be sure, but it seemed to be coming from the bottom bunk. The room was pitch black and the curtains on the window let in just enough light to make out vague shapes in the dark. At first I wasn't sure what the noise was. Sometimes the simplest of sounds can be the most unnerving. I listened closely and realized that it was the unmistakable sound of bed sheets rustling in the dark. The bottom bunk was empty, but when I peered over the edge of my bed, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Something suddenly withdrawing out of sight into the bottom bunk. Something that did not wish to be seen. I lay there in disbelief, trying to convince myself that it was just my fevered imagination running wild. I turned to face the wall and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep quickly. The rustling noise beneath me steadily increased until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was lurking in the bottom bunk began to toss and turn violently. Fear gripped my heart and I had a terrible, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. My pulse was racing and I broke out into a cold sweat. I could hear the sheets thrashing back and forth below. Eventually, I couldn't take the tension anymore and cried out for my mother. Suddenly, the bunk bed began to shake violently, clattering against the wall. The bedsheets below me were still twisting and turning. I couldn't get out of bed in case the thing in the bottom bunk reached out and grabbed me. I imagined it pulling me by the ankle and dragging me off into the darkness. I was trapped in the top bunk, like a cornered rat, unable to flee. I clutched my blanket with white knuckles and waited. The door finally burst open, and my mother came in to calm me down. Tears were streaming down my face. She lay down in the empty bunk and promised to stay there until morning. Eventually, I was able to fall asleep. The next day, as I played in the backyard, I kept glancing up at my bedroom window. Each time, a chill ran down my spine and my hair stood on end. I felt like something was lurking in that room, watching me play and waiting for night to fall, so it could be alone with me again. I tried to tell my parents about it, but they wouldn't listen to me. They just dismissed my claims as childish fears of the dark, and when night arrived, they ushered me upstairs and forced me to get into bed. "Go to sleep," said my mother. "Stop being such a baby." I didn't protest. It was no use. I resigned myself to my fate, climbed up to the top bunk, got under the covers and waited. Lying there in the darkness, alone and frightened, I heard the quiet rustling of bedsheets and knew it was starting again. But this time, it was different. I heard the sound of slow, rasping breathing coming from the bottom bunk. The soft, labored wheezing made me shudder. Only a flimsy mattress separated me from whatever was lurking below. Lying there, paralyzed with fear, I just wanted the thing to leave me alone. Its labored breathing became louder and louder. Then, suddenly, I felt something long and thin, poking at the underside of my mattress. I screamed in horror and the bunk bed began shaking violently. My mother came rushing in and calmed me down with a comforting hug. Eventually, my terror subsided and, with her standing guard, I was able to fall into an uneasy sleep. This continued for weeks. Night after night I would wake up to the sound of rustling sheets. Each time, I would scream for help and the bed would begin to shake violently. As soon as my mother came in, everything would stop and she would have to spend the rest of the night in the bottom bunk, just so I could go to sleep. It was a difficult time for my family. My grandmother was sick and my mother had to go and take care of her. When I found out that my mother would be away for the whole weekend, I flew into a panic. There would be nobody to protect me from the thing in the bottom bunk. No one would answer my cries in the middle of the night. On the day my mother left, I rushed home after school and immediately stripped the bed sheets and mattress off the lower bunk and removed all of the slats. My plan was to prevent that thing having a place to sleep for the night. I hoped that somehow this would protect me. Unfortunately, that night proved to be the most terrifying experience of all. To this day, I shudder to think about it. I managed to fall asleep, but in the middle of the night, something woke me up. The room was pitch black and there was no noise. No rustling of sheets. No movement at all. However, something didn't feel right. Just then, I felt the covers on my bed begin to move. The horrifying truth suddenly dawned on me. The wretched thing that had terrorized me night after night was not in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth and tried to scream, but nothing came out. My eyes were wide with terror and I lay motionless, barely able to breathe. I didn't want to let it know I was awake. I could feel it lying beside me, something cold and slimy, leaning against my right arm. It was lying under the blanket. I could see its outline, but I didn't dare to look. All of a sudden, it rolled over on top of me and I felt its weight pressing down on me. I will never forget that awful feeling. Hours passed and I lay there motionless, in the darkness, too frightened to move a muscle. I wanted to cry, but no tears would come out. Finally, I reached my breaking point and couldn't bear it a moment longer. Ever so slowly, I tried to ease myself out from under it. Inch by painstaking inch, I shifted my weight, moving sideways. Just as I thought I was about to escape, it moved. Dear God! It moved. I felt a clammy hand reach across my chest and close around my throat. Its grip gradually tightened and I felt it squeezing my neck. The horrid, slimy thing began writhing and contorting under the blanket. I could hear it wheezing, rasping and coughing. I felt its breath against my face, foul and cold as ice. Dawn was breaking and the first rays of sunshine were peeking through the curtains. I fought for dear life, but I was no match for it. As its scrawny fingers squeezed my neck, I felt the life ebbing from me. I tried to scream, but the thing's grip was too tight. I was fighting to stay conscious when, suddenly, it released me and slowly withdrew, melting slowly into the wall. I tumbled off the bed and scrambled out of the bedroom. When I got downstairs, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had survived the most horrible experience of my life. To this day, I still break out in a cold sweat at the sound of bed sheets rustling in the night. I spent the entire day trying to convince my father to spend the night in my room. It took some effort, but he finally agreed. Perhaps he was just trying to humor me while my mother was away. Whatever the reason, it proved to be a smart move because, in one night, it solved the problem for good. The very next morning, he stormed into my room and told me to pack a suitcase. We were moving to a hotel. Next story is a creepy story about a hunter who lives in a cabin, deep in the woods. One day, he comes across a beautiful young woman who may not be what she seems. Mike had been out in the woods all day, hunting for deer. When he got back to his little cabin, it was almost dark and he was shocked to find the front door was standing open. Cautiously, he crept into the cabin and was surprised to see a young lady standing in front of the fireplace. She was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. She had a really pretty face and long brown hair that came down to her shoulders. She was wearing a white vest that was tied up over her stomach and a pair of blue jeans that accented her curves. The young lady said her name was Jessica and she was lost. She had come out to the woods to stay at her father's lodge, but had wandered off and couldn't find her way back. She said she had spent all day, wandering in the forest, trying to find help. Mike said that he would help her, but it was too late to go walking through the woods. She would have to stay the night in his cabin, and in the morning, he would lead her back to her father's lodge. Jessica thanked him and offered to cook him dinner in return for his kindness. Over dinner, they talked for a while and Mike was glad to have company. He didn't meet many women, living alone as he did, in his little cabin in the woods. Eventually, Jessica started to get sleepy. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning. Mike told her she could take his bed, and he would sleep in a chair. She climbed into bed, fully dressed, and before long, was sleeping soundly. She looked like she needed the rest. Mike watched her as she slept. He thought she was one of the most gorgeous girls he had ever seen. He wondered if she could fall in love with a man like him. She was the kind of woman he had longed for all his life. Young, brown-haired and beautiful. As Jessica slept on the bed, he sat in a chair, listening to music on the radio. He kept the volume low so that he wouldn't wake Jessica. Then, just as he was dozing off, the music on the radio was interrupted by a local news broadcast. The reporter said that the police were combing the area in search of a prisoner who had escaped from the state hospital for the criminally insane. Mike's ears pricked up. The reporter said that the woman who had escaped was armed and dangerous. She had been convicted of the grisly murders of her husband and 4 other men and was sent to prison. Psychologists who examined her declared her mentally ill, and she was transferred to the state hospital for the criminally insane. However, as she was being transported, she managed to overpower her guards, using a knife she had stolen from the prison cafeteria. She stabbed them to death and escaped into the woods. The police had been searching for her all day. On the radio, they gave a description of the crazy lady. She was 5'4", 26 years old, brunette and very attractive. She had been wearing a prison uniform when she escaped, but they said she would probably try to steal some clothes to disguise herself. The police warned people to be on the lookout for the crazy lady and advised anyone who came across her to keep their distance. Mike's blood froze as he looked at Jessica, lying there peacefully on his bed. She fit the description perfectly. Young, brunette, beautiful and completely insane. She was the escape maniac the police were looking for. He was sure of it, and he was sure of something else too. She was planning to kill him while he slept. He wasn't going to let that happen. He knew what he had to do. Suddenly, Mike jumped out of his chair and threw open the front door of the cabin. Jessica awoke with a fright and looked at him, a confused expression on her face. He grabbed her by the hair, pulling her out of bed and began dragging her towards the door. She started screaming and her arms flailed wildly, trying to catch hold of him. He managed to wrestle her to the front door, then with a mighty heave, he threw her out into the darkness. She landed on the grass outside and immediately jumped up and came running back towards the door. Mike slammed the wooden door shut and had just enough time to lock and bolt it before she slammed into it. He braced himself against the door, expecting her to break it down at any moment. He could hear her outside, pounding on the cabin door with her fists, kicking it with her boots and shouting at him to let her in. And then he heard a scream. An ear-splitting shriek that made him shiver. It sounded like the howls of a crazed animal. The kind of sound that could only be made by a person who was completely insane. Then there was a horrible silence. He could hear something shifting and moving about outside the wooden door. He was shaking with fear, ready for anything. After a while, he noticed a thin trickle of blood coming under the door. Soon, it turned into a pool of blood, flowing across the floor at his feet. Gathering his wits about him, Mike slowly opened the front door, and was horrified by what he found. Jessica was lying there in a pool of blood, and a large knife was sticking out of her head. She was completely naked, and her eyes were glazed over. His mind raced as he tried to understand the strange scene that lay before him. But, stranger still, was the neat pile of blue clothing which was sitting on the grass beside Jessica's dead body. Reaching over her naked corpse, he picked up the blue clothes, and, turning them over in his hands, he realized it was a blue uniform. There was some black lettering printed on the back. It read, "State Hospital for the Criminally Insane." He fell to his knees beside the dead girl's body as he finally understood what had happened. The crazy lady had murdered Jessica for her clothes. Next story is a creepy story about someone that has a strange dream where they meet a childhood friend who offers them some chilling advice. I had a strange dream last night. It was the kind of dream that seems all too real, right up until the point where you wake up in a cold sweat. Last night, when I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, an uneasy feeling came over me. It was almost as if I was being watched, but more than that, I felt like there was someone in the room with me. As disturbing as the feeling was, I still couldn't keep myself from falling asleep. I don't recall how the dream began exactly, but the first thing I remember was walking out of my house. All of my neighbors' houses were gone and I found myself on a long, empty road. It was cold and dark and there was nobody else around. I felt like I was completely lost and alone, but I wasn't afraid. I don't know how long I was on that road. It felt like I was walking endlessly. Eventually, I reached a fork in the road and when I stopped, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. A voice called out to me from the side of the road. "I'm sorry to see you here," the voice whispered. "But it's good to see you." I recognized the voice. It was an old friend from my childhood. Someone I hadn't seen in years. He looked a little different from how I remembered him. Even though we were both the same age, he seemed much younger than me somehow. He was also very pale, and had dark circles around his eyes. His lips were blue. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "I'm here to warn you," he replied. "There's a man in your house." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I was just there." "You don't understand," replied my friend, with apparent urgency. "He's in your house right now." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I was curious. "Who?" I asked. "The cold man," he replied. "He comes to people at night when they're afraid. He waits to be noticed, then he makes his move. You know that chill you feel on your back when something really scares you? That's him standing behind you." "What does he do once you notice him?" I asked. My friend looked down. "Just don't let him in," he cautioned. "What do you mean?" "He can be close forever," my friend explained. "He'll walk around your house at night and even stand in your room while you're asleep, like he is in yours right now. He can know where you are. He can even be looking right at you, but he won't find you unless you let him." "How does he find you?" "I mean, how do you let him?" My friend glanced over his shoulder furtively, as if he was worried someone might overhear. Leaning in close, he whispered in my ear. "If you see him, if you hear him, or if you suddenly start to feel suddenly very cold, don't move. Don't talk to him. Don't acknowledge him. Don't ever let him in." "I don't understand," I pleaded. "How do I get rid of him?" "You can't," my friend replied sadly. "Look, I'm already out of time," I repeated. Not sure what he meant exactly. My friend just shook his head. His eyes were wide and he was shivering. Just then, I noticed a dark figure creeping from the shadows. "My time is up," said my friend. "Whatever you do, just don't let him in. Don't answer it." Before I could ask anything more, my friend was enveloped by the shadows, and something seemed to pull him into the darkness. I couldn't see him anymore. I was about to run after him when I was awakened by a loud noise. When I opened my eyes, I found myself sitting upright in my bedroom, fully dressed. I could have sworn I wasn't dressed when I went to bed. My shoes were covered in a thin film of dust and my feet were sore. I felt so cold. I heard a ringing noise and when I looked down, I saw that I was holding my phone. I was about to answer it when I remembered my friend's words in the dream. I didn't answer it. Eventually, it stopped ringing. I rubbed my hands together. The room was as cold as ice. The feeling that I was being watched was as strong as it had ever been. I could hear something moving inside my closet, but I didn't dare to move. I just closed my eyes and waited. Eventually, I heard footsteps inside my closet. They grew more and more faint, as if walking away down some unseen hallway. When the footsteps finally stopped, the coldness dissipated, and the room returned to normal. He didn't get in this time. If my friend in the dream was telling the truth, if the thing in my closet was who I think it was, I must never let him in. I know he'll be back. I don't know what happened to my friend, but I just hope people will remember his warning. If you start to feel cold while reading this, don't be alarmed. If you hear something in your house, just ignore it. You can't afford to let him find you. Don't let the cold man in. The next story is a scary story about a young couple who get lost in the mountains and come across an old cabin. One day, a young married couple went hiking in the mountains. As the sun began to set, they realized that they were lost. The wife was getting worried, but her husband tried to calm her down and assured her that they would eventually find their way back to their car. However, after walking for hours, they still had no idea where they were. It was growing dark and the man and wife were getting desperate. They didn't have a map or a compass with them, and all of the trees looked the same. Just when they were about to give up hope, they came across an old cabin in a clearing. The cabin looked as if it had seen better days. It was dilapidated and seemed like it hadn't been used in a long time. Some of the windows were cracked and broken, and a lot of the tiles had fallen off the roof. The husband knocked on the front door, but there was no response. When he turned the handle, it slowly creaked open. Inside, they found it was in a bad state of disrepair. There was very little furniture, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. As the couple cautiously looked around, they noticed a strange atmosphere and a peculiar musty smell. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with graffiti. Written in red paint, the words, "Death. Death. 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 Death," were repeated over and over again. The man and woman were unnerved. With a shaking hand, the husband reached out to touch the wall. He was horrified to find that the paint was not yet dry. The couple were very frightened, but they had nowhere else to go. They knew that the mountain was dangerous at night and there were lots of wild animals prowling the woods. Despite the creepy writing on the walls, they decided to stay the night. Going upstairs, they found a moth-eaten mattress that was covered in stains. The husband and wife wrapped themselves in an old piece of carpet to keep warm and tried to make themselves as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. They lay down together on the mattress and eventually managed to fall asleep. Sometime after midnight, the couple were awakened by a strange rustling noise. It sounded like someone or something was moving around outside the shack. "Did you hear that?" asked his wife. "I think there's somebody out there." Her husband listened for a while, but he didn't hear anything. He got out of bed and walked over to the window. It was too dark outside to see anything. Opening the window, he stuck his head out. "Who's there?" he called nervously. There was no answer. He was about to go back to bed when his wife said, "Maybe it's someone who can't speak." The husband returned to the window and said, "Is there anybody out there?" Clap once for yes and twice for no. He strained his ears to listen. The stars twinkled in the night sky. The crickets were chirping loudly. All of a sudden, he heard a loud. The man turned to his wife and said in surprise, "You were right. There's someone out there." He leaned out the window and his eyes scanned the darkness. He couldn't make out anything in the pitch black. "Are you the owner of this cabin?" he asked. "Are you a man?" You're a woman, then. Are you a human? A chill ran down his spine. He swallowed hard and croaked. Did you come here alone? How many are with you? Clap once for each person. Next story is a scary story about a single mother who notices that something is very wrong with her children. I'm a single mother. My husband left me a few years ago for another woman. Ever since then, I have been raising our two sons alone. Mark is 8 years old and Justin is just 6. The other day, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. I saw Justin in the backyard. He was playing football with someone, but I couldn't see who it was. All I could see was Justin kicking the ball and someone else was kicking it back to him. I assumed it was his brother Mark. I was startled when I heard footsteps coming down the stairs and Mark came in and sat down at the table. I wondered who Justin was playing with. My children are not allowed to invite anyone into the house without my permission, so I called Justin to come in for dinner. Annoyed, I asked him, "What were you doing?" "I was playing with my friend," he replied. "What friend?" I asked. "You know you are not allowed to invite anyone over without permission." "No, Mom, my friend from the tree," he said. "He likes to fly." Irritated, I told him to stop making things up. Justin insisted it was true. He said his friend didn't want to come inside the house because he might scare me. I realized he must have an imaginary friend, so I started asking questions. "What's your friend's name?" I asked. "Melkor, Mom." "And where does he live?" "I don't know," he replied, "but he always comes to play." "What kind of games do you play?" "All sorts of games. He always comes down from the tree and he asks me if I want to fly like him." At that moment, I felt a shiver run through my body. I heard the sound of laughter coming from the backyard. I got up to see who it was, but when I peered out the window, I couldn't see anyone. "It's him, Mom," said Justin. "He's waiting for me to come out and play." For some reason, this unnerved me. I suppose I wanted to prove to myself that this Melkor wasn't real, so I told Justin to invite him in to have dinner with us. Without saying anything, Justin got up and walked over to the door. He beckoned with his hand, then came back and sat down at the table again. I looked at the doorway, half expecting to see someone come in, but there was no one. "Stop staring at the door, Mom," Justin said. "He's already here." I told Justin to stop playing around and started to scold him. Mark began to chuckle. Then, the chuckling got louder and turned into cackling laughter. It sent a chill down my spine. I scolded Mark, but he wouldn't stop. His cackling just grew louder and louder. It sounded evil and malicious. "I told you not to play with Mark," said Justin. Mark could not stop laughing and Justin just sat there calmly eating his dinner. I shouted at Mark and told him to stop playing around. All of a sudden, he stopped laughing and grabbed my hand. Then, in a deep, rasping voice, he said, "You also want to fly?" Then, he burst into that ghoulish laughter again. I was so disturbed by his behavior that I left the room and went upstairs to calm down. I don't know why, but his laughter sent chills down my spine. It was unsettling. I could still hear it coming from the kitchen. After a while, everything was silent. When I went downstairs again, the boys were back to normal, playing video games on the TV. The next day, I left work early. By the time the children returned home from school, I was already preparing dinner. Everything seemed normal. I told the boys to wash their hands, and when they sat down at the table, I served their meals. Everything seemed normal, until I asked my sons what had happened the day before. Mark's face was blank. He didn't seem to remember anything about it. Melchior was eating with us, Justin said casually. But Melchior never came to sit at the table, I said. He did, Mom. Justin insisted. Are you sure? I asked. Why didn't I see him? Mom, you told me to invite Melchior to dinner and I did what you said. What do you and Melchior do together? I asked. When Melchior comes to play with me, he flies down from the tree, he said. We play games, but sometimes he gets angry because he doesn't like losing. That's when he lets me fly and he just stays on the ground, playing alone. When I heard those words, my skin began to crawl. Then I asked Justin about what happened yesterday when his brother started laughing. Melchior came into the house yesterday, but he was angry because he doesn't like Mark. So he let Mark fly and he ate with us. And do you remember flying, Mark? I asked. No, Mom. Mark replied. I just remember I was eating and you were sitting at the table. Then, I closed my eyes and when I opened them, you were upstairs in your room. I felt sick to my stomach. I was finally beginning to understand what he was saying. This Melchior had possessed my son Mark right in front of my eyes. Justin, who is this Melchior? I demanded. Mom. Remember those two children who were burned up in the fire? When he said that, the blood ran cold in my veins. Yes, I answered hoarsely. Years ago, in a house not far from where we lived, a whole family had been killed. The house had been set on fire, and it burned to the ground. All they found afterwards were charred remains. But that all happened a long time ago, before my sons were even born. How could they know about it? Well, the boy is Melchior, Justin said. Who told you about that fire? I demanded. Was it the other children in school? No, it was Melchior, Justin said. Sometimes at night, he comes down from the trees and he just stands there very still, watching you while you sleep. I keep telling him you don't like being stared at, but he doesn't listen. My stomach was churning and I felt like I was going to throw up. What did he tell you about the fire? I managed to croak. He told me one night he heard noises in his house and they woke him up. And when he peeked out the door of his room he saw his dad lying dead on the ground. And then he heard a scream and he saw two men cutting his mother's throat. He said he and his sister ran and hid in the closet and they were really scared. After a while they didn't hear anything outside, but they were still afraid to leave. Then they smelled smoke and they couldn't see, and it started getting really hot. And the last thing he remembered before he fell asleep was that his whole body was on fire. After hearing this, I was speechless. I've never been so scared in my life. And the worst thing is, my children don't know what is happening. Since then, I haven't been able to sleep a wink. I don't know what to do. I need help. My children are being possessed, and how can I sleep knowing that a dead child is watching intently at my bedside? The next story is a spooky little ghost tale about a man who is out walking one day, when he is caught in the rain and decides to take shelter in a small house down a country lane. One evening, I was out hiking in the country when it started to rain heavily. I looked around for shelter and, down a muddy lane, I spotted a dilapidated cottage with a thatched roof. When I opened the door, the inside was dark and damp. At the far end of the cottage, there was a room with a little rusted stove. I packed some pieces of wood into it and lit the fire. Just as I was taking off my boots and sitting down to warm myself, I was startled to hear some footsteps in the passage outside. Suddenly, a man appeared in the doorway. He didn't even seem to notice me as he walked straight over to the stove and began warming his hands in front of it. He was dripping wet and his clothes were completely soaked. It didn't seem to be possible to get so wet, even on such a rainy night. Water dripped from his old hat and sizzled on the embers of the fire. I cleared my throat and the man turned his head and stared at me over his shoulder. I could see his teeth chattering and noticed that his face was pale white. "Not many people come here," he said. "Why's that?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Ghosts," he said, turning back to the fire. "The ghost of the man that lived here. It's a sad tale. He drowned himself down in the pond by the old mill. They found him floating there, and when they pulled him out of it, he was all slimy. Since then, some folks say they've seen him floating on the pond and other folks have seen him lurking outside this cottage, walking up and down. Drowned himself in the pond, so they say, and now he walks the night." The man sighed, and I could hear the water squelch in his boots. "But that's just the story the superstitious people tell," he continued. "I never saw a ghost myself." "I haven't either," I laughed. "I never believe the tall tales people tell." He looked at me again and said, "Some folks do, and some folks don't." The water was still oozing from his clothes, dripping all over the floor, and a dank smell filled the room. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Can't you get dry?" "Dry?" He laughed weakly and his laughter turned to a hacking cough. "I can never get dry," he cried. And with that, he thrust his muddy hands into the fire up to his elbows. The flames didn't touch him at all. Without another word, I grabbed my boots and ran screaming out into the night. The next story is a creepy story about a young girl who notices something strange about the new teacher at her school. The summer holidays had ended, and it was the beginning of a new school year. There was a young girl who did not want to go to school. Her name was Barbara, but her friends called her Bara for short. Although she wasn't the best student in her class, she still managed to get good grades and actually enjoyed learning new things. It wasn't the schoolwork that she disliked, it was the teachers. No matter how hard she had tried to behave herself, the year before, she always seemed to get into trouble with the teachers in her school. Every week, something had happened that caused her to be the object of her teachers' anger and frustration. They would often make her stand at the front of the classroom, give her hundreds of lines to write or punish her with extra work. It made Bara dread the thought of going to school, and she was worried that this year would be worse than the last. When she arrived at school, on the first day, she was surprised to find that there was a new teacher in her English class. The English teacher was a woman in her 30s, with a sour, humorless face. Her light brown hair was done up into a bun, and she had a mole on her upper lip. Bara hoped that this teacher would be different from the rest. After lunch on Friday, as she was going back to class, Bara dropped her books in the hallway. When she bent down to pick them up, she noticed that the school janitor was staring at her legs and licking his lips. She gave him a disapproving look and pulled her skirt down over her knees. "Creepy old man," she muttered under her breath. Later that day, Bara was sitting in class, listening to the English teacher ramble on about grammar and punctuation, when a girl named Ashley raised her hand. The teacher stopped in mid-sentence and pointed to the young girl. "Ashley, do you have a question?" she asked. "Yes, miss," said Ashley. "Why do your moles keep changing?" The teacher appeared suddenly confused and flustered. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "The moles on your face," said Ashley. "They keep changing. On Monday, you had one mole, but on Tuesday and Wednesday you had 3. Now it's back to 1 again." All of the kids in the class began laughing. It was such a bizarre and random question. "Your eyes must be deceiving you," replied the teacher angrily. "As you can plainly see, I have one mole on my face. Now, if you have nothing relevant to say, I would appreciate it if you would refrain from disrupting my classroom and keep your foolish mouth shut. Throughout the rest of the day, Bara noticed that the English teacher kept staring at Ashley. It seemed as if she was seething with rage and there was hatred in her eyes. At the end of class, as the other kids were leaving, the teacher called Ashley over and told her she wanted to have a word with her. Bara was just relieved that, this time, she was not the one getting in trouble. On Monday morning, when Bara got to school, she noticed that there was one empty desk in the classroom. Ashley was absent. In fact, she didn't turn up for school the next day, or the day after that. Bara began to wonder what had happened to her, but when she asked around, nobody seemed to know. There was something else that was bothering Bara. She had begun paying more attention to her English teacher's appearance, making detailed notes in the back of her book every day, and had noticed something very strange. The teacher's moles actually were changing. There was no doubt about it. On Monday, she had one mole, but on Tuesday, she had two. By Wednesday, it had gone back to one mole. But that was not all. When Bara consulted her notes, she found that, on Monday, the teacher had been wearing a band-aid on her little finger. On Tuesday, the band-aid was gone, but by Wednesday, it had returned. Bara had a sneaking suspicion that something very odd was going on. That evening, after school finished, she decided to follow her teacher and find out where she lived. She unlocked her bike and cycled around the block a few times, until she saw her teacher's car pulling out of the school parking lot. Bara followed the car, making sure to remain at a safe distance, until they arrived at a small apartment building in the suburbs. The teacher parked outside the dilapidated building, walked up a flight of steps and disappeared through the front door. Bara locked her bicycle to a lamppost and was just about to go up the stairs, when she spotted the teacher coming out again, carrying a large, black plastic bag in her hand. The young girl quickly hid under the stairs and watched as the teacher came down, then went behind the apartment to dump the rubbish. This is my chance, thought Bara. Gathering her courage, she ran up the steps and slipped through the open door before the teacher returned. She found herself standing in the kitchen of a small apartment. Looking around, she was shocked to see a woman sitting at the kitchen table with her back to her. From behind, the woman looked exactly like her teacher. Suddenly, she heard the sound of the knob on the front door turning. Looking over her shoulder, she realized it was her teacher returning from dropping off the rubbish. Bara just had time to climb into one of the kitchen cupboards and hide before the woman saw her. Sitting in the cupboard, afraid to make a sound, the young girl could hear the two women talking to each other in hushed tones. Then, she heard footsteps approaching and the sound of another woman's voice as she entered the kitchen. Peeking out through the slats in the cupboard door, Bara could see everything clearly. There were three women sitting at the kitchen table. Bara could hardly believe her eyes. It was too shocking to believe. All of them were identical. Triplets. She thought to herself. Of course. It all makes sense now. That's why the teacher's appearance kept changing. The three of them must be working at the school on alternate days, all of them pretending to be one woman. That's insane. Just then, Bara saw a man walk into the kitchen. It was the school janitor. One by one, the women stood up, hugged him tightly and kissed him on the lips. Oh my God, thought Bara. They're all married to one man. They're bigamists. What would you like for dinner tonight, darling? Asked one of the teachers. Same as last night, replied the janitor. Breast or thigh? She asked. A nice, juicy thigh, said the creepy old man, licking his lips. One of the women opened the door of the refrigerator, and Bara's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. She had to cover her mouth to stifle a scream. Hanging in the freezer was the dead body of her missing classmate, Ashley. Her hair was frozen stiff and frost lined her eyebrows and eyelashes. There was a long, thin icicle dangling from her nose. Both of her arms and one of her legs had been hacked off at the joint. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Bara saw the janitor suddenly sit bolt upright in his chair. His head was cocked at an odd angle as he held up his nose and began to sniff like a dog. "I smell something," he cried. "I know that stench. It's the scent of a young girl." All four of them got up and began searching the kitchen, peering under tables and throwing open cupboards. Bara cowered in her hiding place, trembling with fear as she listened to them sniffing and snorting like animals, trying to catch her scent. Suddenly, the cupboard doors were wrenched open, and she saw the school janitor standing there, surrounded by his 3 wives. He was drooling at the mouth at staring at her bare legs. "Fresh meat," he cried as he beat his chest with his fists, and howled like a wolf. "Fresh meat! Fresh meat!" echoed the women. They started grunting like pigs and began leaping around the kitchen on all fours like crazed monkeys. The school janitor grabbed Bara by the hair, pulled her out of the cupboard and wrestled her to the ground. She tried to fight him, but he climbed on top of her and pinned her shoulders to the floor with his knees. His wrinkled mouth opened wide, revealing crooked and misshapen teeth. Saliva dribbled down from his lips and splattered against Bara's face. She screamed in horror and shut her eyes. The next Monday, at school, Bara's classmates noticed that she was missing. When she didn't turn up for class the next day, or the day after that, they began asking around, but nobody had any idea what had happened to her. None of her classmates could have guessed that, as they sat listening to their English teacher drone on and on, about verbs, nouns and pronouns, Bara's frozen corpse was hanging in a meat locker at the teacher's apartment, and her severed limbs were in a pot, slowly simmering on the stove. Next story is a scary horror story about a young woman who encounters a strange man in the woods. It was a cold and windy night. Susan Ledger was standing on the dock, clutching her suitcase, and waiting anxiously for a boat to arrive. It was dark and she glanced around nervously. She had the strangest feeling that someone was watching her. All of a sudden, she heard a rustling noise in the bushes behind her. When she whirled around, she was shocked to see a man standing there. He was dressed in ragged clothing, and he was clutching an axe in his hands. Who are you?" she cried. "That don't matter," the man replied with a smile. "You look good. Real good. I bet you taste good too." Susan let out a horrified scream as the man raised the axe above his head. He brought it crashing down with a loud thump. The razor-sharp blade embedded itself in her skull, killing her instantly. The man was pleased. It was a clean kill. Quickly, he grabbed her by the legs and dragged her body into the bushes. He carried her through the trees and back to his cabin, set back in a remote part of the forest. He dumped her in the bathtub, pulled off her clothes, then went out to the shed to fetch his chainsaw. It was messy work, but after a few minutes, he had chopped her body into pieces. The man roasted the legs in the oven and made a soup from eyeballs and severed fingers. Then, he sat at the table and gobbled down as much as he could eat, savoring the taste of human flesh. Later that night, while he was going through her coat pockets, he found a letter. As soon as he read it, his eyes grew wide and his face went pale. "Dear Miss Ledger, your test results came back. We regret to inform you that you have leprosy, and it is contagious. We have arranged for you to be treated at a special isolation clinic. It is located on a remote island off the coast. A boat will meet you at the dock on Friday night at 11 p.m. Please make sure you are there." That's it for today's episode. Hope you like the stories. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, share your comments and share this video. Thank you.